Good morning. Can you come and sit down slowly, please? I'm Antonia Benedek, Chair of iu3a, and I think I should start again with the safety regulations of this church and the fire exits, although this place is not as complicated as the previous place we used to meet. Obviously you can see there's a big door at the back, which must be the obvious way out, but should anything really serious happen in Upper Street, the way to get out of this place is via a staircase on either side of the altar. Over there, and there's a passage in the basement, and it ends up in a gathering place on that side of the church, which is where Joy will count all of you as you come out to make sure you've all made it out of the building. Before I introduce our speaker, Martin Plaut, I have to make an important announcement about our activity groups, which some of you might have already seen in WOW or on the website. We are still actively advertising for someone to help Lisa Haywood, the group support lead. Lisa, can you just sort of stand up and wave your hands? She will be at the back of the hall after Martin has finished speaking to talk to you about support for her to run the groups. With our 80 plus groups at the moment, but quite a few people have come forward with ideas for new groups. Also, we have an excellent number of new members, but quite a few people have come forward with ideas for new groups. Sorry, we have excellent number of new members, but often not enough groups for them to join. The Executive Committee is very committed to encouraging the formation of a wide variety of new groups. To this end, we would like to find someone with the rather difficult name of New Groups Support Lead to volunteer alongside Lisa and to help her with her enormous job. And Lisa is our current group support lead. The person who will help Lisa will work with potential group leaders and help them develop their ideas for the group, find a venue for their activities, help them contact members through the Beacon database, and advertise their activities on WOW and the iu3a website. Now Lisa does all this already, and the person she's asking to help her, she will give every guidance, and she just needs some help because it's a big, big job. I think it's probably the most important job on the Executive Committee. If you're interested in anything to do with groups or just curious to speak to Lisa after the meeting, she will be at the back, and you can talk to her, have a chat. And also, her email address is on the home page of our website. I do hope you will talk to Lisa after the meeting, even if you don't intend to become a new groups lead, just to find out more about groups. Thank you. Now we come to our speaker, Martin Plaut. Martin has reported about Africa as a journalist and author for over 30 years. He has covered every country from Cape Town to Cairo, the wars, droughts, famine and crises, and the powerful growth and surging development across the continent. Most of his career was with the BBC. He is now with the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. I've lost the second bit. And he has worked with the Royal Institute of International Affairs and also advised the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the State Department. Martin's latest book illuminates the full story of slavery in Africa. And after the talk, Waterstones have come to sell the books if you're interested in when he's finished his talk. Martin, look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. I'm not only, as described, I'm also a member, so I do come to events occasionally, particularly to Chris Bulford's wonderful fringe theatre group, which I can certainly recommend. So, without further ado, let me crack on. This is about slavery in Africa, and it is designed to be the whole picture. 5,000 years, of course we can't be sure when it began, but we can be sure when we're sure when it did begin, if you see what I mean. It may be earlier than that. And there is somebody who is campaigning about slavery today. He's from Niger, and he is the president of iu3a, which campaigns about slavery. And I don't mean people in nail bars. I mean people who are bought, sold, owned, or inherited in Africa today. Next slide. I just thought I should begin with this because it's very easy when one talks about slavery to forget the human being behind it. And I'll just read it up in case you can't see what it says at the back. This is by Elizabeth Freeman, and I found it in Massachusetts in 1781. That was when she was living there. It's in a wonderful museum. And it says, any time when I was a slave, 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me, and I'd been told I must die at the end of 1 minute, I would have taken it. Just to stand for 1 minute on God's earth, a free woman, I would. And I think we should never forget the people that really are at the heart of this story and the suffering that continues to this day within slavery. Next, please. So this is the image of slavery, or the map of slavery, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with. This is the transatlantic slave trade. Everything that you know about the slave trade is more or less accurate. What we say about it is true. The only thing I think is really interesting about this is two elements. One is how many were taken from Angola. Angola, the Portuguese colony, was different from the other colonies along the coast of Africa, which were just little fortresses. The Portuguese were different from anybody else from Europe, in as much as they went deep into Africa, both in Angola and in what is effectively Mozambique, or the area around Mozambique. Hundreds of kilometers in, and enslaved large numbers of people themselves. Most of the rest of the European slavers did not take people themselves. They bought people from the local elite. Occasionally they seized people, but that was very rare. Mostly the slavery was done by Africans who transported them to the coast and traded them with Europeans. It doesn't mean that we have any less responsibility, but there was a different system in which they operated. And you can see some of the slaves that ended up in America actually came all the way around the Cape, and others, but the vast majority went to Latin America, particularly Brazil. Next slide. These are the conditions on which the Europeans took them. I'm probably familiar with that image. It is the way in which Africans were transported. I mean, just extraordinarily terrible conditions. This is a British ship, and they had 5 feet 5 inches long and 1'3" wide, and were at about slightly over 2 feet. You were crammed in there day after day after day. The men were shackled, and they actually, interestingly, something I had to know about, these people who enslaved them employed other slaves as what were called guardians, and they gave them knives and whips, and they told them, if there's any trouble, you beat people. Because, of course, the slaves outnumbered the people who were the enslavers, whether they're British, French, or whoever, hugely. So there was a problem of discipline. And there were revolts. There were revolts, and there are examples of people freeing themselves, even on the trip across to the Caribbean or the Americas. Next. So here we are, we have the scale of the slave trade. And this is just the transatlantic slave trade. So it begins with the Portuguese who started in 1444 when they traveled down the west coast of Africa. They weren't actually going for slaves, but they thought they'd take a few while they were there. It wasn't a big deal. They took maybe half a dozen, 8, 10 up to Portugal. There was very little interest in them because slavery was not part of the European system of production at that time. However, it then coincided, of course, with the discovery and the conquest of the Caribbean and the beginning of tea and, of sugar, and our demand for tea from China and India, and the huge rise in the trade in tea, and in sugar. And that is why you've got this vast rise in slavery, because after the Europeans had conquered the Caribbean, they thought, well, we're not going to do this work, it's much too hard. They tried to take the local people. The local people either died of smallpox, killed, or they disappeared into the hills. And they thought, well, we're not going to do this, what can we do? And then they thought, hang on, there are all these people in Africa. And the Portuguese had begun to take small numbers and then soared. And the big difference between this form of slavery and the other forms of slavery I'll talk about is that there's this vast spike in slavery across the Atlantic, which is different from the other forms of slavery that people were involved in Africa. And you can see that the Portuguese were by far and away the biggest slavers. They took nearly half of all of the 5.8 million slaves. Britain is the next, with about 3.25 million. And that is the scale of the slave trade across the Atlantic. Next. Here we are, we have the first evidence of enslavement in Africa, which was nothing to do with the transatlantic. This is the first etching that we can find, or has been found, is 2900 BC on the second cataract of the Nile. It's etched into it. This is actually a later etching, but it's still BC. And you see it's absolutely clear what's happening. These are people who've been brought from Nubia, which was the southern part of Egypt and Sudan, then brought up the Nile. They're being written off, and they are being beaten by Egyptians. And there's no way you can mistake what is going on. This is the beginning of that we know that slavery goes back at least this far in Egypt. And the Egyptians continued bringing people up the Nile for well into the 19th and 20th century. And in fact, there are probably still people who are suffering that fate today. Next. This is the next stage in which, so the Egyptians bring them up, they conquer people in the southern border of Egypt, goes further south when they're powerful and are pushed back when they are less powerful. And they take people all the way from Ethiopia, Sudan, and parts of the Sahel. But the next thing that's really enormous, of course, is the arrival of Islam. There was slavery in Saudi Arabia at the time of Muhammad, the Prophet, and when he dies, Islam then takes off and crosses from Arabia into Egypt. They take Egypt and then they spread right across the whole of North Africa and into Europe, into Spain and Portugal. And they conquered the area, and you essentially had two choices. You gave in, became a Muslim, or you were a slave. And it was as simple as that. Most of the Berbers, particularly on the north, became part of that. Now, they had been involved in trade across the Sahara before the arrival of Islam, but it was enormously enhanced at this time, and you can see the trade routes there. You can see the dotted line at the top shows how far it had gone. It was about 700 AD, and then by 1300, 1400 AD, it had gone much further south, all the way down across the Sahara into the belt where you find people living in the forested areas. As I said, this is not the beginning of slavery in these parts of the world, but it became the trade route by which the slaves were brought up from the southern states and across the Sahara into North Africa. It was appalling, absolutely appalling. There are examples of people freezing to death because the desert can be extremely cold. There are examples of whole caravans being overtaken by sandstorms and being buried or running out of water. It was excruciating. Particularly one of the worst is called the 40-day route, which takes you from Darfur up to the Nile. And I mean, the death rates were at least as high as they were across the Atlantic, and sometimes even higher. For boys who were taken up there, they then had a second fate, which was that many of them were taken as eunuchs and were castrated. And between 60 and 90% of them died of septicemia. And I mean, there are examples and descriptions that people have of them. And as somebody who saw it, he said, and he was himself a slave, he said, I will never forget that to the end of my days, the excruciating pain that was inflicted upon these young boys. So it was an appalling system. Next, please. Here's the upper grade form of slavery, which is frequently overlooked. It is much longer than the transatlantic slave trade, and it is slightly larger. I mean, it's essentially the same size. But people were taken from everywhere, from, shall we say, Sudan, all the way down to the Cape, and were then brought across the Indian Ocean. They were taken to Arabia, Egypt, Persia, India, and as far as China. Now, those that were taken to China were all taken by Arabs. This is before the arrival of the Europeans in the Indian Ocean. And they were taken there, they were as novelties. They were not there as part of the system of enslavement, which certainly existed in China, but the Chinese enslaved each other. I mean, it's one of the things you learn when you do any work on this, is that there is nothing surprising about slavery. And whether it was the Greeks who enslaved people, or the Romans who enslaved people. I mean, the Romans, for example, conquered North Africa. They didn't take many Africans. They had so many people from Asia Minor whom they used as slaves that they didn't need them. So they did occasionally take people, but it wasn't a big issue. If you were conquered almost anywhere in the world, you were a slave. It was either that or be put to death. And this is argued that actually it's slightly better to be a slave. You can decide that for yourself. Those are the roots. I mean, one of the things to note is how it extends all the way up to what is modern-day Turkey, and in fact into the Crimea. There are examples of Crimeans having African slaves who were part of the system they lived in. Many of them were used in the harems, some of them were used as in the homes, others were used in different ways. And the most important form of which I shall come to in a minute. Next, please. This is Amr, who was in Ethiopia. He was an Oromo, if you know Ethiopia. He was seized and taken by the Omanis, first to Arabia and then to India. And it was a well-established route. Thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of Ethiopians who were taken. And they were taken, almost all of them were taken were men, because they were taken as military slaves. And he rose to become a very senior leader of one of the states in the Deccan, because he became the military leader and he helped the Sultan crush his enemies. And he took on 2 Mughal emperors, whom he defeated through being one of the most skillful generals of his time, and even the Jahangir, who was the emperor at the time, who said really rude things about him when he was alive, ended up saying actually he was a marvelous general and an extremely capable man. He used all sorts of tactics. For example, he used his cavalry very skillfully. The Mughals took the cities, but he held the countryside, and he just attacked them from behind. He even flooded the area with the dams, and they were defeated. We know all of this because a Berber who went all the way through to China eventually, recorded what he found. And he found thousands upon thousands of Africans, particularly Ethiopians, in all the way from northern India right the way through to Sri Lanka. And he recorded where they were, he describes the villages. We know that it is true. So he's one of the most remarkable representations of that period. Next. These people are something of a rarity. There are in India about 100,000 people who say, we were slaves. We were sons and daughters of African slaves. But they are a rarity because, as I said, there were almost always men who were taken to India or the Indian subcontinent because they needed them to fight. There were some women, but of course they mostly, they had died out, they were killed, or they found an Indian wife and then they became part of the local community. But there are at least 100,000 in India and 150,000 in Pakistan who trace their ancestry to Africa and African slavery. They still use similar vocabulary, they sing songs that they brought with them, and they are still discriminated against very badly. They suffer. They're called the Sidi community, and both in Pakistan and in India, they have a really hard time of it. And it's one of the great tragedies of India. I mean, I spent a year in India, and while I loved India, I think it's the most marvelous place. I mean, the way that they treat some of their minorities is utterly appalling. Anyway, that's a different talk. Next slide, please. Here we are. We have the Zanzibar slave market, and the Omanis came down from Oman and made so much money out of clothes and slaves that they moved their entire sultanate to Zanzibar and operated deep into Africa. Somebody who we'll see in the next slide, if I may, is Tipu Tip, who is was the most prolific of all the slave traders from Zanzibar. He would send his either his own people, or he would send the Swahilis that he worked with across the continent. Some of them would travel for 2 years and more to the other side of Africa. Livingstone found them in the Caprivi Strip in Namibia. They certainly went to the coast of Angola, and then they would march people back with something you've probably seen, which is these terrible, what they call coffles, which are chains or planks of wood round their necks. Men would be linked like that. Women would just be required to walk with them. They were forced to carry the other great product which came from Africa, which was ivory. And it was said that so many died along the way that you could literally smell your way from one side of Africa to the other by the rotting flesh of that took place. It's absolutely appalling. Just in parentheses, because I'm not going to go into detail, in the 1890s and 1880s, he fought a war with King Leopold, whom you may remember was one of the most notorious enslavers, who actually was given the whole of the Congo at the conference of Berlin in the 1880s, and would cut people's hands off, ensure that people's hands were cut off if they didn't get enough, bring enough rubber that was required, because he thought he had to make money out of this. And Leopold and Tippett fight a war in the center of Africa along the Congo tributaries, and eventually, because the Europeans had artillery and machine guns, they defeated Timbuktu's men, and Timbuktu then is in Zanzibar as a defeat. But the Omanis kept a whole string of colonies along the coast of East Africa for many, many years. And it was only when Britain sent a fleet into the Indian Ocean that eventually they were forced to stop it. But it took a long, long time. Next. Here we are, we have the other thing which is absolutely clear about Africa. I've talked mostly about external powers, but there were also indigenous slavery. And I'm just going to give you two examples of this. One was Ethiopia. And the Ethiopians, for certain, went on slaving amongst their own people from the beginning of time. And it continued right the way through Ethiopian history. This is a photograph of, it says, rich merchants. This is actually there's a caption at the bottom. Rich merchants accompanied by their slaves bringing bags of money to Emperor Haile Selassie as contributions to Ethiopia's war chest. This is 1935, when Ethiopia had been invaded by Italy, which came up from Eritrea and attempted to conquer Ethiopia and turn it into part of the Italian Empire. The Italians wanted to have an empire which went all the way from Somalia through Ethiopia. They wanted to take Sudan and all the way to Libya. They aimed to have, this was Mussolini's grand dream. Didn't get that far, partly because of the role of Britain, which invaded from both Somalia and from Eritrea, and eventually put Haile Selassie back on his throne. But at the time of the 1935, there were between 300,000 and 400,000 slaves in Ethiopia, and some of them were in his own palaces. So there's no doubt about it. And in fact, some people I have spoken to said that they remember as late as the 1960s that there were people in the south who were being enslaved. Now, these are not people mostly from the highlands. These were mostly people from the lowlands or from Sudan that they brought in, they enslaved. So the people over the hill, if you see what I mean. Next, please. This is what the Italians did. They used the slave issue, which was a big issue in the League of Nations, as a way of attacking the Ethiopian legitimacy and saying that it was entirely right that they should take Ethiopia, since it was clearly a savage country and they were going to free the slaves. And there you see propaganda. You see the Italian soldier freeing the Ethiopian slaves, breaking off the shackles. It may have happened, but this was clearly propaganda. This is not what really happened. They did free people, this is true, but there were still slaves even after the war when Haile Selassie returned. Thank you. Next. Here we have the other great slaving power. For 100 years, ending in 1903, the Fulani come out of the desert and enslave mostly the Hausa of northern Nigeria and Niger. And they set up an enormous caliphate with about 35 emirates, all the way from Cameroon up to Burkina Faso. I don't know if you can see the shaded area, but it is this area that they have. And they took slaves both southwards through what is now Nigeria, Benin, and through Ghana. The Ashantis didn't get those gold stools for nothing. They made a lot of money out of trade and slavery. And they also took them northwards and up to Tripoli. And this is how it worked. And the conditions in which the slaves were held were again terrible. And they were used in plantations, because there was cotton was grown, and then they would be in dye pits. They would use the indigo to dye the cotton cloth. They would weave the cloth. If they misbehaved, they were held in prisons, and the descriptions of the prisons are, which I have in the book, are appalling, utterly appalling. And I mean, they were held at the discretion of the owner. They were not given indefinite leave to remain, if you see what I mean. Next. Here you have an image of the Fulani. They were cavalry, and that was in a sense how they defeated the local peoples. The local people were mostly sedentary. They were scattered in small villages, and as I say, they also they had marvelous, very beautiful armor that they wore. The cavalry was partly, some of the horses actually came from Europeans who traded with them, but these ones were not. I mean, the Fulani were involved in empires right across the whole of Africa in this period. Next. And here you see Lord Lugard, him with the feathers, seeing the Emir of Katsina in 1907. In 1903, the British sent an expedition up the Niger River and eventually crush the caliphate and take Sokoto, which is the capital. It then took 20 years to free the 2 million slaves that Britain then inherited. So Britain ends slavery in 1807, and in the 1830s it ends the slave trade. So between, should we say for argument's sake, between 1840 and 1903 or 4, there are no slaves in the British Empire, or very, very few. There are tiny communities, but they effectively ended. In 1904, when Lugard takes, 1903, when Lugard takes it, all of a sudden Britain has 2 million slaves on its hands. And it takes a long time to gradually free them and release them. Some of them just fled, quite frankly. But, you know, the entire economy was based on slavery, and if they had freed them immediately, it would have collapsed. So there was this decision was taken, a difficult one, and he has been criticized for taking too long, but that is what happened. Next. So this gives you the minimum view of slavery in Africa. You see the Indian Ocean, but the dates you see are not from the beginning. These dates were ones that I found which were in good academic literature. So between, this is 800 to 1900, you have 2.5 million. Transatlantic, 1500 to 1867, about the same. The Trans-Sahara, you can see the dates. I hope you can see them at the back. Can you? Not? Yes? No? Okay, well I'll read them out. So, Indian Ocean, about 12.5. Transatlantic, 12.5. Trans-Sahara, 9.3 million. The Sokoto Caliphate, and this is just at one date, 4 million. The Ottomans, who also took slaves, about 1.3 million between 1800 and 1900. And the Barbary Corsairs, who were an offshoot of the Ottoman Empire, across Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, they had about 1 million, probably more. Iran, about 147,000, and that's only in the 19th century. And Ethiopia, in 1 year, 1935, it had 300,000. Now, that comes to 41 million. Because we know it went for much longer, I have estimated that there are at least 50 million Africans who were enslaved, of whom we were responsible for for about 3.8 million. That doesn't make any better or worse what we did. We are responsible for what we did, but it gives you the scale of the entire thing. Now, you've got to be very careful with the numbers, because if in a typical situation a village of 100 people was attacked by their neighbours, say 10 people were killed, they then would take, shall we say, out of those, they would take 70. They would leave the very young and the very old, say 70 and march them to the coast. Let's say 60 people made it to the coast, the rest died along the way. They were then bought by Europeans, and this is just one model, but out of the 60 were bought, and they would reject 10. I'm making up the figures, but you get the message. So there were then 50 of them. Out of those, perhaps 10 would die on the voyage to the Caribbean, so you're left with 40. And they were then possibly transshipped to another island or to America, so you end up with, shall we say, 30. So out of the original 100 people who were in the village, only 30 arrive in shall we say, North Carolina, or wherever they are finally going to. So the figures depend on where you do the measurement, and that is why you've got to be really careful with understanding what is happening here. And the one thing is sure, there was suffering all along the way. Next. As I said, there is slavery in Africa to this day. Slaves are still to be found in Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Sudan, and Libya. Libyans were being bought and sold for just $500. Slaves were being bought and sold in Libya for $500. This is a picture taken about 10 years ago, and it is continuing to this day. People who flee from places like Ghana or from Sudan, across the Sudan from Ethiopia or Eritrea, end up in Libya. Many of them die along the way, but those that get there then have to try and get to Europe. And if you don't have the money to pay the traffickers, they will sell you, and you end up as a slave. I can describe what happens to you. I've spoken to people who this happens to. It is utterly appalling. Next. This is a Professor Obokata, the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery, and he reported in 23 that there were 200,000 Malians living under the direct control of their masters. Now, these reports are made every year to the United Nations. He makes these reports. Have you ever heard about them? I certainly hadn't until I started working on them. And it is an absolute disgrace that we know this figure, we know what is happening, he files his reports, and that's it. As far as I can tell, he almost works on his own. Next. And this, I'm afraid, is the most shocking part of the whole thing, which is that the African Union and the Arab League has 9-10 members in Africa, the African Union represents the whole of the continent, is not interested. They do not want to look at this. This was from last year. They said, on this day, Africa Day, we commemorate the 62nd anniversary of the founding of the Organization of the African Union, the African Union, established in 1963, and we declare the 2025 to be the AU theme of justice for Africans and people of African descent. And here you see it says transatlantic slavery, colonialism, apartheid, systematic racism have caused immeasurable harm, which of course they have. But there is no mention at all of anything about indigenous slavery, about the Indian Ocean slavery, about the Barbary pirates, about the Sokoto Caliphate, or the Ethiopians, and there are many others that you can go to. And this is brushed over. They don't want to address it because it would, of course, mean addressing their own problems. They would have to say, our members in the African Union are involved. And I think the other thing that's really sad is that the anti-slavery society, which did so much to end enslavement around the world, doesn't really look at contemporary African slavery today. They do, in theory, you can find reports by them, but they're much more interested to look at the equivalent of nail bars and people who are living in this country or in other parts of the world who have passports taken away. Now, clearly between, shall we say, Bill Gates and the slave, there is a huge, shall we say, scale of remuneration. Some people get a fortune for their work, some people get nothing. And I'm not trying to minimize the suffering of people who are in nail bars or cleaning cars here for a pittance and have their passport taken away and are beaten. I think it's appalling, but they are not slaves. They are, in the end, will be free people. But there are people to this day who are bought, sold, and inherited in Africa. And I think that is the biggest scandal that we face, and this is where we should put our emphasis. So I'll stop now, with 15 minutes. I'm happy to answer any